governance policy can be one of the most helpful tools an enterprise has, or it can become the kind of paperwork people quietly work around. And the difference usually comes down to whether the policy is truly aligned to clear objectives. In this episode, we'll make policies feel practical by connecting them to the outcomes leaders actually care about, such as consistent decisions, managed risk, reliable services, and measurable value from technology spending. When policies are written as generic rules with no obvious purpose, they create friction, slow decisions, and invite exceptions that pile up until the policy loses credibility. When policies are tied directly to enterprise objectives, they become guardrails that reduce confusion and speed up work because people know what is expected and why it matters. The goal is not to create fewer policies at any cost or to create more policies to look mature, but to create policies that are clear, useful, and proportionate. By the end, you should be able to explain how governance policies support enterprise objectives and how leaders can avoid turning governance into bureaucracy. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good starting point is understanding what a governance policy actually is, because beginners often confuse policies with procedures, standards, or checklists. A policy is a high-level statement that sets direction and rules for behavior, usually describing what must be true, what must be done, or what must not be done in order to support enterprise outcomes. A procedure describes how to carry out a task step by step, while a standard defines consistent requirements that make a policy measurable and enforceable. Policies sit at the leadership level, which means they should be readable and meaningful to business leaders, not only to technical specialists. A strong policy tells the enterprise what decisions should look like, what boundaries cannot be crossed, and what accountability exists when boundaries are violated. It also clarifies the reason behind the rule, not as a long justification, but as a clear connection to an enterprise objective like trust, reliability, compliance readiness, or cost discipline. When you keep that definition in mind, you stop writing policies as collections of details and start writing policies as governance levers that shape behavior across many teams. This is the foundation for aligning policies without creating bureaucracy, because a policy that tries to be a procedure will almost always become heavy and difficult to follow. Alignment means the policy is written to support a specific enterprise objective, and that objective must be more than a vague statement like improve security or improve governance. A well-aligned policy is connected to a clear outcome that leaders can recognize and monitor, such as ensuring that investments are approved based on defined criteria and tracked for benefit realization, or ensuring that risk acceptance decisions are made by appropriate authority and recorded. If the enterprise objective is improved customer trust, a policy might focus on consistent handling of sensitive information and reliable service performance, because those are things customers experience. If the objective is faster delivery without unacceptable risk, a policy might focus on clear decision thresholds and standard change governance, because speed is improved when boundaries are known. If the objective is cost efficiency, a policy might focus on reuse of shared services and avoidance of duplicated platforms, because duplication is a predictable cost driver. The key beginner lesson is that alignment is not a branding exercise where you paste the strategy statement into a policy document. Alignment is a design choice where every major policy rule can be traced back to an objective, and every objective has at least one policy that supports it in a practical way. Policies become bureaucracy when they add friction without increasing clarity, and the easiest way to prevent that is to ensure each policy answers a real decision problem the enterprise repeatedly faces. Enterprises often struggle with the same recurring questions, such as who can approve major exceptions, what evidence must exist before funding, how risk is escalated, and what minimum controls are required for critical services. A policy that answers those recurring questions reduces debate and speeds up decisions, because it removes uncertainty and makes outcomes more predictable. Bureaucracy happens when policies are written to satisfy hypothetical concerns rather than real recurring decisions, or when policies duplicate each other and force teams to comply with multiple overlapping rules. Another bureaucracy pattern is when a policy demands outcomes that are not achievable with current resources, which trains people to ignore the rule or to create informal workarounds. A governance-minded approach treats policy writing like engineering a stable system. You want simple, clear rules that improve reliability without adding unnecessary complexity. When you hear the word bureaucracy in governance, think less about the existence of rules and more about whether the rules create value by improving consistency, reducing risk, and protecting the enterprise's objectives. One practical method for alignment is to start with the enterprise objectives and then work backward to identify the behaviors that must be consistent in order to achieve them. If the objective is consistent risk management, then behaviors like explicit risk acceptance, documented exceptions, and regular review of high-risk issues must be consistent, and the policy should focus on those behaviors. If the objective is reliable decision-making for investments, then behaviors like requiring a business case, defining expected benefits, and assigning benefit owners must be consistent, and the policy should focus there. If the objective is coherent technology direction, then behaviors like following enterprise architecture guardrails and managing exceptions must be consistent, and the policy should be built around those decision paths. This approach is powerful because it prevents you from writing policies based on personal preference or copying a generic template. It also helps you keep policies short and direct because you are writing only what is necessary to drive the behaviors that matter for objectives. A beginner-friendly way to test this is to ask whether the policy will change how decisions are made tomorrow, and if you cannot name the decision it changes, the policy likely needs to be rewritten. Alignment is achieved when the policy is a tool people can use in real time, not a rule people discover after something goes wrong. Another major way bureaucracy sneaks in is through policy sprawl, where policies multiply and overlap until nobody is sure which one matters most. Policy sprawl creates confusion because teams face conflicting requirements, and confusion is a hidden cost that slows work and increases risk. Governance avoids sprawl by using a clear policy hierarchy, where policies set direction, standards define consistent requirements, and procedures describe execution. When the hierarchy is clear, a policy does not try to contain every detail, and standards can be updated without rewriting the policy's purpose. Policy sprawl is also reduced when policies are consolidated around objectives rather than around organizational silos, because silo-based policies often duplicate content with different language. Another sprawl trigger is writing policies in response to single incidents without checking whether the policy overlaps with existing controls, which can create duplicate approval steps and unnecessary reporting. A healthier approach is to treat incident-driven changes as opportunities to improve existing policy structures, simplifying and clarifying rather than adding new layers. When a policy ecosystem is clean and hierarchical, people can follow it under pressure, and that is one of the clearest signs that governance is aligned without being bureaucratic. Policies also become bureaucratic when they are written without considering decision speed, because enterprises need to move, and governance that cannot move will be bypassed. Aligning policies to objectives includes aligning them to the enterprise's required pace, which means policies should define thresholds that determine when strict oversight is required and when standard delegated paths are acceptable. For example, a policy might state that high-impact decisions require review by a specific authority, while low-risk decisions follow standardized processes without extra approvals. This is not a loophole. It is proportionality, which is essential for governance to be usable at scale. Policies that force the same heavy review for every decision create bottlenecks and train teams to avoid governance, which undermines the very objectives the policies were meant to support. Policies that are too loose for high-impact decisions create unmanaged risk and inconsistent outcomes, which also undermines objectives. The governance skill is defining thresholds that match risk and enterprise impact so speed is preserved where appropriate and oversight is focused where it matters most. When policies include proportionality, they support both alignment and agility, which is exactly how governance avoids becoming bureaucracy. A crucial part of alignment is making policies measurable and actionable, because an objective that cannot be observed cannot be managed. A policy does not need to include a long list of metrics, but but it should be written so the enterprise can tell whether the policy is being followed and whether it is supporting the objective. For instance, if a policy requires business cases before funding, it should be possible to verify that major funding decisions consistently include defined benefits and accountable owners. If a policy requires explicit risk acceptance, it should be possible to verify that high-risk exceptions are documented and approved by the right authority. If a policy requires consistent handling of sensitive data, it should be possible to verify that classification and access practices are applied consistently. This measurability supports accountability because owners can be held responsible for compliance with the policy and for correcting deviations. It also supports continuous improvement because leaders can see whether the policy is producing the desired outcome or whether it is creating unintended friction. Beginners sometimes think measurement turns governance into surveillance, but governance measurement is primarily about knowing whether the system is working. A policy aligned to objectives is one that produces evidence of its own effectiveness. Policies must also be designed with adoption in mind, because a policy that is not followed does not protect objectives no matter how well it is written. Adoption depends heavily on clarity, meaning the policy uses plain language, defines who is affected, and avoids ambiguous terms that invite conflicting interpretations. Adoption also depends on feasibility, meaning the policy's expectations can be met with the organization's current capabilities or with a realistic plan to build those capabilities. Another adoption factor is integration, meaning the policy is connected to the standard processes people already use, such as funding requests, change reviews, and access approvals. If a policy requires separate paperwork outside normal workflows, people will treat it as optional under time pressure. Governance leaders also support adoption by communicating the purpose of the policy in terms of objectives and outcomes, so stakeholders understand the value rather than feeling controlled. Beginners often assume compliance happens through enforcement alone, but enforcement without adoption creates resentment and workarounds. When adoption is designed into policies, governance becomes the default behavior because following policy is the simplest and most predictable path. Exception handling is one of the most important features for avoiding bureaucracy because a policy that cannot handle real-world constraints will be bypassed. Exceptions are not a sign that the policy is weak. They are a sign that the enterprise environment is complex and sometimes requires temporary deviation. What matters is whether exceptions are governed in a way that preserves alignment to objectives. A healthy policy environment defines how exceptions are requested, who can approve them, what justification is required, what risks are introduced, and how long the exception can last before it must be remediated or renewed. This prevents favoritism, because exceptions follow a legitimate path rather than personal influence, and it prevents silent risk acceptance, because exceptions become visible and owned. It also prevents permanent fragmentation, because time-bound exceptions force the enterprise to either return to standard or deliberately revise the policy if the policy no longer fits reality. Beginners sometimes fear exceptions because they sound like loopholes, but governed exceptions are actually a control that keeps policy credible. When exceptions are visible, governance can learn whether the policy is too strict, outdated, or missing support from shared services. Exception discipline is a key way policies stay aligned without becoming rigid bureaucracy. Another way to keep policies aligned and non-bureaucratic is to treat them as living instruments that are reviewed and improved through operating rhythm, rather than as permanent monuments. Enterprise objectives shift, external requirements evolve, and technology capabilities change, so policies must be revisited to ensure they still support the current mission and constraints. A policy review rhythm does not mean rewriting everything constantly. It means periodically checking whether policies are still understandable, still feasible, and still effective in producing desired outcomes. Weak signals like rising exception volume, increasing decision delays, repeated noncompliance, or recurring confusion about interpretation can indicate that a policy needs clarification or redesign. Reviews should also check for overlaps, where multiple policies demand similar evidence or approvals, because overlaps create unnecessary friction and encourage shortcuts. Governance should be willing to simplify policies when simplification increases adherence and improves outcomes, because complexity is not a sign of maturity. When policies are improved through a steady rhythm, governance stays adaptive without losing clarity. This continuous improvement approach is one of the strongest defenses against bureaucracy because it keeps policies tied to real enterprise needs rather than to historical assumptions. Enforcement is still necessary, but enforcement should be designed to support objectives rather than to punish people for mistakes that the system invited. A policy that is enforced inconsistently becomes political, and political enforcement destroys trust and increases bypass behavior, which directly undermines governance objectives. A better approach is consistent enforcement paired with support, meaning the enterprise provides the tools, shared services, and guidance that make compliance practical. Enforcement should also be proportional, focusing attention on high-impact violations that create real risk or misalignment, rather than punishing small deviations that do not materially affect outcomes. When issues occur, governance should ask whether the policy was clear, whether the process was usable, and whether the owner had the authority and resources to comply, because many failures are system failures rather than individual failures. That does not remove accountability, but it shifts accountability toward improving the governance system so the same failure does not recur. Beginners often think enforcement means strictness, but governance enforcement is about reliability. The enterprise can trust that policies will be followed in the situations that matter most. When enforcement is consistent, fair, and supported, policies become part of normal behavior rather than a source of fear or resistance. Communication is another essential alignment tool because policies often fail when stakeholders misunderstand them or believe they exist for the wrong reasons. A policy aligned to objectives should be communicated in terms of what it enables, such as faster approvals through standard criteria, safer change through predictable checkpoints, or stronger trust through consistent data handling. Communication should also clarify what decisions the policy affects, what roles are responsible, and how exceptions and escalations work, so the policy becomes usable in real moments. If communication is missing, people learn policy indirectly through enforcement events, which often creates a negative culture where policies are seen as traps rather than as guardrails. Communication also supports cross-owner alignment, because policies often require coordination between business owners, technical custodians, risk owners, and operational teams. When those groups share the same understanding, decisions become smoother and less political. Beginners sometimes underestimate how much miscommunication creates bureaucracy, because confusion creates repeated clarification meetings and repeated rework. Clear communication reduces that hidden cost by making expectations stable and predictable. In governance, communication is not a separate marketing effort. It is part of control effectiveness because it determines whether people can comply consistently. To close, aligning governance policies to enterprise objectives without creating bureaucracy means designing policies as clear, purposeful guardrails that directly support measurable outcomes, rather than as sprawling documents that add friction without value. Well-aligned policies start from enterprise objectives, define the behaviors that must be consistent to achieve those objectives, and use a clean hierarchy so policies set direction while standards and processes handle the details. They include proportional thresholds to protect decision speed, measurable expectations to support accountability, and governed exceptions to handle real constraints without inviting silent risk. They are integrated into normal workflows so compliance is the easiest path, reviewed through operating rhythm so they stay relevant, and enforced consistently and fairly so trust is maintained. When policies are built this way, governance becomes less bureaucratic, not more, because the enterprise spends less time negotiating what should happen and more time delivering value within acceptable risk. This is the core idea behind policy alignment in governance. The policy exists to make good decisions repeatable, not to make people feel controlled.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.